Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise to respond to the Governor's address, and I'd like to congratulate Her Excellency Barb Baker AC on her appointment. I think that's an excellent decision by the Government, and also just like to acknowledge that given that process occurred during a period of caretaker, to thank the Premier Peter Gutwin for his consultation at that time and the work that DPAC did in ensuring that we were made aware that that was the appointment the Government wanted to make, and think that she'll do an excellent job. Now, she does have big shoes to fill. The Honourable Professor Kate Warner AC is an extraordinary woman, and I think many Tasmanians have come to love her in her time as Governor of Tasmania, including myself and her husband Dick, and wish them all the very best for the future. And I'm very pleased to see her appointment to the new position announced in the Governor's address yesterday. I think she's an outstanding person who will give her all to that role, and I truly hope that as an outcome of that process we can see a pathway to treaty for Tasmania with clear framework for reconciliation, land handback to Tasmania's first people, and a much greater understanding across our community about the truth of our history. And I know that each of us in this place who've spoken so far have shared the same view, which I think is an excellent place for us to start as a Parliament. I'd also like to congratulate everyone who has been elected, either returned or newly elected to this place, and it was great to hear Chrissy Johnson's first speech. As my colleague said, first speeches are some of the best speeches that we hear here in this building, and I certainly enjoyed hearing her talk about what motivates her and what we can expect from her contribution in this place. I'm very excited to take on my new responsibilities as Shadow Treasurer and Shadow Minister for Hospitality and Events. There's quite a lot to get my teeth into, particularly in the Treasury portfolio, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I reflect on the most recently released fiscal sustainability report. If members haven't read it, they really should, because it does lay out over the next 15 years some projections for the state of our budget, which we all really need to have an eye to as we make decisions in this place for the future of our state and future generations. I'd like to congratulate my colleague, the Honourable David O'Byrne, on his election as Leader of the Parliamentary Labor Party, and Anita Dow's Deputy Leader of the Parliamentary Labor Party. They have my full support, and I wish them all the very best in their roles, because I fundamentally believe that a Labor government is the best political party to improve people's lives, and I know that they both each share values that represent the Labor movement incredibly well. Values of fairness and equality and social justice, standing up for working people and making sure that vulnerable people have their voices heard. I know that we as a political party will always fight to reduce inequality and to support our state's prosperity with sustainable economic development. And I, as always, am very proud of this Labor team that I'm a part of. I think that every single one of them is deserving of being in this place, and I wish them all well. I'd also like to thank everyone who was a part of the Labor campaign. This is the first opportunity I've had in this Parliament to talk about that. It was a very short election compared to elections I've been involved with in the past, and I'd like to commend our campaign committee, all of our amazing volunteers, all of our candidates who put their hands up, for their tireless endeavours to ensure we got out and spoke to as many people as we could in that time, and made sure that we saw 9 Labor members return to this place. I think from some commentators there was an expectation that the Liberal government going to an early election, which was a year early, was done to take advantage of the Premier's COVID popularity, and that there would be a whitewash, and the result would be an overwhelming Liberal majority government returned to the Parliament. That wasn't the case, Mr Deputy Speaker. Yes, they've won an election. I congratulated the Premier on election night, but only just scraped in with their majority. The gamble to go early only just paid off, and I think that what I would like to acknowledge is that, if nothing else, the people of Tasmania have given notice to the Liberal Party as the government of this state, that there are issues that need to be addressed. They can't be ignored. And I've heard the Premier talk about some of those things in speeches he's given since, but it has to be more than lip service, Mr Deputy Speaker, because people rely on us to make those decisions as their leaders to improve their lives. So there were some resounding statements that I heard from the community during the last election that need to be responded to by this government, and responded to quickly in the case of those people in particular who are most vulnerable in our community. The next 4 years will require all of us to work hard. The Premier continues to talk about his commitment to providing compassionate government. I hope that is the case, and I hope that we see that delivered through policy outcomes and a commitment to make tough decisions. And I referred earlier to the fiscal sustainability report, which does project some pretty dire financial scenarios that will need to be addressed in this term of government. I hope that we are here for the full term. Maybe I don't. Maybe we should go to another early election, Mr Deputy Speaker. But I do hope the Premier doesn't give up on the job early, like he did earlier this year, particularly at a time when so many people need us to be concentrating on the delivery of better essential services, the rollout of infrastructure projects to create jobs, and actually getting on and doing our job as members of this Parliament. Because there are serious and real problems in health and housing. They have been well documented for a long time, not just during the course of the last election, and life is becoming harder for so many Tasmanians. We're seeing wait lists grow for public housing, for health services, whether it's elective surgery, which for many people is not elective at all, it is necessary surgery, or for outpatient appointments, where it's grown to more than 50,000 Tasmanians, Mr Deputy Speaker. 1 in 8 Tasmanians is on a health waiting list. It's incredibly difficult for thousands of Tasmanians who can't afford to get in to see a GP, who are living in pain. These Tasmanians deserve better. They deserve a government that's going to work to address that, and I wish the new Health Minister all the very best in his role, because it's a big task, very big task, but an incredibly important task. The concern that I have is that this government has a track record of announcements, but an absolutely terrible record of delivery. And that's not just in infrastructure, where we've seen a complete failure to keep up their end of the bargain, but also their failure to deliver the promises that were made around access to essential services that is impacting on the lives of thousands of Tasmanians who are living in pain, waiting for health care, or living in fear because they don't have secure accommodation. And I hear the Premier and others on his side bleating about record funding. Record funding for infrastructure commitments really does mean nothing to somebody who has just found out that their cancer has progressed beyond the point of treatment because they couldn't get in to see a specialist, Mr Deputy Speaker. And that rather than being able to have a treatment plan that sees them recover, they are now looking at options of pain management and relying on hope. And they're some of the horrible, heartbreaking stories that I'm sure many of us have heard in this place, because people simply cannot get in to see the specialist that they need to at the time they need to, and their illness progresses, they become more unwell, and in some cases their situation becomes terminal. So for those people, the rhetoric about the Premier's government's commitments to compassion stings a little bit like the cold winter wind in your face. Particularly, I think of those women who are escaping family violence, and I'm sure, again, many of us have had instances through our offices or interactions where we've spoken to exactly these women who are forced to go back into untenable situations because they can't access emergency accommodation. Shelters are turning people away, turning women and children away. These people are the forgotten people in Premier Peter Gutwin's Tasmania, because not enough is being done to support them right now. And I do just want to say again that I fundamentally believe that the Premier and his government have been put on notice at this election. Yes, he won, and he won a particularly strong vote in Bass, and I acknowledge that on the night of the election as well. But they were only just returning majority, and it did include Adam Brooks in that count at that time, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the issues that continued to be raised without prompting by the community throughout that election campaign were ones of health and housing. Their deep concern that things aren't right, either within their own family or what they're seeing happen to other people, and the feeling that was starting to creep in that the Liberal government might have something to do with that. Now, for me, on election night, as those results came in, it was for those people that I feel most distressed for. The heartbreaking stories that have been shared with me and other members of my team, and the hope they had for some change that would bring relief to them, that would provide the change they needed, that wouldn't be realised because the government wasn't changing, and they are who I call the forgotten Tasmanians, that I truly hope this government can turn its mind to. And I hope that with new ministers in a couple of different portfolios we can see some changes there, because those Tasmanians deserve better, Mr Deputy Speaker. The thousands of Tasmanians who've had their lives put on hold while the government's put them on a waiting list. The thousands of Tasmanians who get sicker because they can't access the healthcare that they need. And the thousands of Tasmanians who are without safe and secure housing or a place to call home. And I think too of our state's public sector workforce, and I wanted to acknowledge them in my contribution today and thank them for the work that they've done. I'm sure having an early election wasn't something they expected either, Mr Deputy Speaker, drafting incoming government briefs and all of the work that's required when an election is called, dealing with caretaker mode that seems to go on forever when you're waiting for the results to come in from any election we have in Tasmania. I just want to thank them for their hard work and dedication. In particular, I wanted to acknowledge our health workforce, Mr Deputy Speaker, because they do an incredible job. But they do want more than our praise. They need resourcing. They need to be supported with additional staffing because staffing levels are critically low in some areas because the government appears happy to use vacancy control as a way to manage the budget rather than actively recruiting to fill positions as they open up. Our health workforce is not just a balance sheet item, Mr Deputy Speaker. They're the backbone of the health of our state. And without them, waiting lists will grow longer, people will get sicker, the productivity of our state will decline, and we will lose more and more of the workforce as they walk away from a system that fails to recognise their worth and support them to do their job. And I have to say that I thought the government's promises and commitments to health at this election were completely inadequate to stem the bleeding. And unless more serious corrective action is taken, then the situation that our health system is currently in faces the bleak possibility of becoming terminal. I said it earlier, but I do really wish you all the very best, Jeremy, in your role as a Health Minister. And I also know that Dr Bastian Sajo would be willing to work proactively with you, and as we all would, to invest in the areas that need urgent attention, supporting the decision-making that's required to identify those areas and putting in place a clear plan to tackle the more serious structural problems that will require commitments that go beyond election cycles. The Fiscal Sustainability Report again projects a future where health spending continues to consume more and more and more of the state's budget, and it's important that if future governments commit to the type of allocation, that spending be strategic and that make a difference. Otherwise, future generations stand to lose big time, and I personally am not willing to sacrifice the prosperity of the state or their prosperity because the government today failed to make the right decisions, even if they are difficult ones. The Labor Party did set out a pretty solid health plan at the most recent election, and I encourage you to draw from it, examine it, pull it apart, take out the best bits, do what you need to, please, because I think there are some good things in there that could be used right now to make a difference. And I think this is one situation, Mr Deputy Speaker, where I encourage plagiarism. Go for your life. Because I think in this case, every good idea should be adopted. And it's not just the delivery of essential services that this government needs to make big improvements. There's also a need to fundamentally reassess their approach to economic development and in particular skills and training. Now, for years now, the Labor Party has led the debate on TAFE and vocational education and the important role it plays and continues to play in our state's social and economic development. Now, I do believe that the government fell asleep at the wheel and failed to take action early enough to address the looming skills shortage that we saw coming across a range of industries and sectors years ago. We set up our industry advisory councils after the 2018 election, Mr Deputy Speaker, across a range of different industries, hearing consistently, no matter which industry we spoke to, that skills shortages was their number one issue and they needed better support to be able to fill the vacancies they had. It's not a new problem, but what is happening right now is as a consequence of failure to take action by the government when they should have done. It does appear, when it comes to this issue, that complacency is the government's middle name. And unfortunately for Tasmanians who are looking for work or a new career, or for businesses looking to grow, the government's inertia has been exposed and it is having an impact on our state's economic development. I think just this week of the hospitality business in Launceston that's closed its door for 2 weeks because they couldn't find skilled staff, and they lamented what's happening in our skills and training system. So what's the government doing? Well, instead of what they should be doing, which is funding TAFE appropriately and working with the teaching cohort and industry to meet the needs of students and the workforce, the government instead thinks that meddling with the governance structure is the way to fix the problem. The attack on TAFE and some of the insulting dot points that the Premier continued to read from in his remarks during speeches or debates that he and I had during the election campaign to justify his government's plan are just plain wrong. And what the new Education Minister needs to do is take the time to talk to the workforce, to the students, to industry, and get in and do the hard work of addressing the problem rather than just flicking it off her desk into the lap of a GBE. A new minister means there can be a reset in policy, and if the government really cares about the future of vocational education in Tasmania, then taking a hands-on interest in this issue would be a pretty good place to start, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, I just want to reflect a little on the economy and the budget, and noting the remarks made by our leader, David O'Byrne, that the economy needs to work for everybody, and I couldn't agree more. At the moment, we've got a situation where the government cherry-picks data to talk about what's happening across the Tasmanian economy, but ignores some of the structural problems that are becoming worse for some who are looking for work, in particular those who are underemployed, youth who are looking for work. Our youth unemployment rate is too high, Mr Deputy Speaker, and our general unemployment rate is too high, especially once you get out to the regions. Now, the fiscal sustainability report outlines a number of challenges for our state to address if we're going to deal with the forecasts that it outlines, or the projections that it makes, I should say, because under every single scenario that it projects, the state is heading into worsening levels of net debt and a declining budget position with deficits as far as the eye can see, Mr Deputy Speaker. The executive summary makes it very clear. It says, this analysis undertaken in this and previous fiscal sustainability reports has established the importance of the following. Early action to correct fiscal deterioration will mitigate the severity of the measures required to effectively maintain fiscal sustainability. Given the composition of the state's revenue base, it is not possible to rely entirely on economic growth to maintain fiscal sustainability. Any action to maintain fiscal sustainability must recognise and address major drivers of a deterioration in the budget position, and that it is likely that effective action to maintain fiscal sustainability will require the successful implementation of a range of measures. Those measures could be a number of things, Mr Deputy Speaker, but I haven't once heard the Premier, as the Treasurer, outline what action he intends to take. What are those measures? And how will he protect future generations from inheriting a growing debt and deficit problem with the Tasmanian state budget? It can't be something that's put off into the future. I read his press release when this document was released, and he talked about Tasmania's strong position. Might be right for him right now, Mr Deputy Speaker, but there is no doubt that future generations will pay for our lack of action if we continue to put the matter off. And I just wanted to, again, recommend this document to members of this place if you haven't read it. I know that everyone's pretty busy, but it is fundamentally important to what needs to happen in our state in order to ensure our children don't inherit a legacy from us that we should all be ashamed of. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think back to the 2018 budget, that was handed down by Peter Gutwein, where he called it the golden age, the so-called golden age. In 2018, when he handed down that budget, and what do we see for it today? Because waiting lists are blowing out, whether it's health or housing, infrastructure projects not being rolled out, deficits and debt as far as the eye can see when you look at Tasmania's state budget. And it's not all because of COVID, Mr Deputy Speaker, because in 2019, pre-COVID, the budget that was delivered by the government at that time, by Peter Gutwein as the Treasurer, forecast net debt to rise to over $1 billion. What action has this government taken since it started to see the deterioration in the budget? What are they doing to protect future generations against inheriting a complete mess? So we will do our job in holding this government to account, in particular holding the Premier to account for his promise to bring the budget back to surplus by 2022-23 and to make sure that they do keep debt levels manageable. It's also important that they keep their promise not to privatise public assets like TAFE or to introduce new taxes, because those things will have a detrimental impact on the cost of living for Tasmanians. Mr Deputy Speaker, the situation for many Tasmanians, particularly this winter as the bills are rolling in, is pretty bleak. And we do need to make sure that we have a much better response to support people, particularly families, and particularly those who are vulnerable or with children, so that they can get through. And on this, I'd just like to quickly reference what's happening on the East Coast before I conclude. And I wrote to the Premier earlier this week on behalf of residents of the East Coast about the impacts they felt since the Tasman Highway closure, because I think the government's failed to acknowledge the broader social impacts that are being felt there. They've certainly talked about the impacts on the business, and the package of support that's been released is a good first step. But again, I outlined to the Premier that I think that there'll be more that needs to be done. But the social impacts on this community have been quite profound, from Swansea to Buckland. Road closures are having a significant impact on families, children travelling for school, people who've been displaced from one another, particularly those with caring responsibilities, who've had to move away in order to continue to go to work or maintain their study. The impact on their vehicles, the wear and tear of travelling on Wailancta Road, the cost of fuel, the cost to the workforce, because there are workers on the East Coast who have lost hours or have had their hours reduced because they've had to factor in travelling on Wailancta Road, and it, particularly at night time, can be quite tricky. So there are workers I've spoken to who are starting work later and leaving work earlier. They're not being paid during that time, so they've lost income during this period. And further to that, I was frustrated, I suppose, and concerned to hear that the council hadn't been consulted at all around the development of the hardship grants or in any of the design of a support package for that community when I met with them. And I hope that's been rectified now. But surely you'd think you talk to the level of government close to the community before you roll out a package of support. Same goes for the peak organisations supporting that community. And just to illustrate the impact on people's lives, both professionally and personally, and I'd like to acknowledge Bella Hart here for compiling this for me. Here's a story of a woman travelling to Sorell for her 10-year-old footy training each Wednesday afternoon. That's had to stop because there's not a suitable car to travel along Wailancta Road. And this has upset the child immensely because they were starting to make new friends. Another person who's had to cancel her son's hospital treatment, which were needed to prepare him for upcoming surgery because she can't travel on Wailancta Road and can't justify going the alternative way through Lake Leak as she's a single mother and there isn't time to do this trip within school hours. Someone else has had to pick up extra shifts at work, impacting on the time that she has with her children on weekends. And this is because staff can't get through from the Buckland end because the road's shut. The 8 Ball Association has been impacted because the current roster and the formation of the rounds mean that it works between Buckland, Triabunna and Swansea, and they can't compete. Same goes for the footy club, who I know was put in a position where they might not be able to hold their games at home, which means they don't get the gate takings or the revenue over the canteen or the bar, because other teams didn't want to travel the long way around. So the impact on sporting clubs has been quite profound. Transport businesses, bus companies that will lose money because they can't do school excursions because of the road closure. Road closure affecting a mother who has a son who is severely autistic and he attends a Southern Support School in Howrah. He'd usually get a taxi to school, but unfortunately he's unable to attend school because of the closure. The taxi was willing to drive Wellington Road, but because of insurance issues and no phone reception, it was decided it wasn't safe. There's another example of a woman who's been impacted because her son had to go to hospital because of his tongue tie. That's now need to be changed, the appointment that was scheduled, and she's going to have to wait even longer to get in because, as we know, the waiting lists to access healthcare in this state are woefully long. Somebody else who's faced with her dad's upcoming cancer surgery in Hobart had to be at the hospital very early in the morning on the 15th of June, and she's terrified, obviously that's past now, going through Wellington Road because of the wildlife and of the fact that it's a gravel road and it's very different for people to drive on who've never travelled on those types of roads before, and she expressed her anxiety when driving due to an accident caused by a tourist on the Tasman Highway. And so just this simple change in roads and the condition of the Tasman Highway makes her incredibly nervous. Someone else whose daughter's currently having regular visits at the orthodontist in Rosny and is worried that they will not be able to drive through Wellington because of their anxiety, so they'll have to go through Campbelltown. Someone else who manages holiday houses in Orford, and that's their job, and they've just had a large number of bookings for next month cancelled as guests don't want to go through Wellington Road and not willing to travel the extra distance. None of those scenarios have been considered when the government's thinking about how they support that community, which is why I wrote to the Premier, because that road closure, whilst there's a prediction that it'll reopen on sometime in the middle of July, there's no certainty about that, Mr Speaker, as you're well aware. So I just wanted to put that on the record because it's an example of where the government needs to act a little bit more urgently, Mr Speaker. As I conclude, and I just reflect on the past year and particularly the past few months, I'd just like to, what comes to my mind is I suppose what matters to all of us and what priorities are for us, particularly about to have a baby, thinking about what really matters. And I just think about some of the structural problems that we have in our state. My children are lucky. They're growing up in a home where they're loved, they've got somewhere safe to live, they've got food in their tummy, but there are so many other young children in our state who don't have that. And I hope that my children never know what it's like to live in poverty, but there are so many other children who sadly do, and their experience of growing up would not be so lucky. 1 in 4 Tasmanians is living in poverty. Thousands of children across our state are living in poverty, and whilst many of them were lifted out when the job seeker payment was introduced, thousands of them have been plunged back into poverty since it's been returned to a much lower level. Families who could afford to pay their rent, feed themselves and pay their bills all in the same week during that time, and it was life-changing for them, are now finding themselves scrimping and saving or making difficult decisions again. The necessity to tackle structural disadvantage in our state is our highest priority, Mr Speaker. And it's a focus this government must have. It's going to improve the lives of thousands of children in our community. Future generations are already demanding that we do more, and we hear their voices on the lawns of this Parliament as they march for climate justice and action on climate change. They stand up bravely and unite in the chorus of enough is enough. They are telling us that we have to do better. And not only do we need to hear them, Mr Speaker, but we need to act. And if our future is in their hands, as we so often hear people say, then we need to pay closer attention, because their hands are small and the problems are so big. Mr Speaker, I give my commitment to work with this dedicated Labor team and this Parliament to do all we can to make a positive impact in the lives of all Tasmanians.
Members,
our resolve to
time
make Tasmania a better and fairer place hasn't changed with the outcome of the election.
has now expired.